All right, everyone, I think we'll get going. Thank you again so much for joining us. I'm Will Schwarz. I'm the president of the Maryland Lynching Memorial Project, and I really appreciate you all joining us here today. I want to go over just a few ground rules. The discussion is being recorded. We ask that you please stay muted unless there's an emergency, and please feel free to ask questions in the chat window, and we'll respond as we can. I did want to mention, for those of you who may not be familiar with us, a few things about the Maryland Lynching Memorial Project. We were founded in 2018. We're a 501c3 that works to advance the cause of reconciliation in our state by documenting the history of racial terror lynchings in Maryland. We advocate for public acknowledgement of these crimes, and hopefully we work to honor and dignify the lives of the victims. I did want to take a moment to share with you. It's important to know these names and to honor these people. And it's important also to note that no one was ever held accountable for any of these crimes. I did want to also share with you an idea of where these murders occurred. This shows you the number of lynchings in each county. There are 24 counties in Maryland, and we know that racial terror lynchings happened in 18 of the 24. The names, the county names that you see in red are counties where there are coalitions to advance the cause of racial conciliation, also working on community remembrance projects along with us and EJI. I did want to now introduce the panelists for this evening, in more or less in the order of appearance. Dr. Nick Creary is Associate Provost for Academic Inclusion and Innovation, and he's also Associate Professor of History at Moravian College. He is on the board of the Maryland Lynching Memorial Project and represents our organization on the Maryland Lynching Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Dr. Kabolile Zvovgo, I'm sorry, Kelly, if I screwed that up, is the founder and director of the International Justice Lab at William & Mary, also a newly minted PhD, as we were discussing. She works in human rights, transitional justice, international law, and courts. And just as an aside, shortly after Maryland passed the law that created the Lynching Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Kelly wrote a really clarifying article about the potential benefits and obstacles for the state commission, looking forward to it. And we invited her, and she appeared actually at the first public meeting of the commission at UB Law, along with Cheryl and I a few years ago. And we're just thrilled to have her come back with us. And so thank you, Kelly. Virginia Ladish has been with the International Center for Transitional Justice for 15 years. She's led the efforts to involve young people in transitional justice processes in the Americas, in Africa, and in Asia, and also has worked in its reparations program. Chloe Jackson is founder of the Brownsville Project, which is, I believe, an effort kind of to remember and honor this historic Black community by the same name in Frostburg. She also created the Allegheny County Truth and Reconciliation Committee, which is an affiliate of the Maryland Lynching Memorial Project. And she's done some really groundbreaking work in facilitating meaningful dialogue around the history of racial terror in Western Maryland. And it just so happens that the very first scheduled public hearing for the commission will be in Allegheny County in September. So it's very fortunate for us that she's here. And Terry Freeman has, since February, been the executive director of the Reginald Lewis Museum of Maryland, African American History and Culture. For 6 years prior to that, she was the president of the National Civil Rights Museum, located at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis. But she's no stranger to Maryland. She's a longtime Howard County resident, and the Lewis and Maryland is fortunate to have her. We in Maryland are justifiably proud that we are the first state in the union, the only state, to create a lynching Truth and Reconciliation Commission. because we're the first, it's really incumbent on it comes with a great responsibility. So we need to, it's incumbent on us all to make sure that the enterprise succeeds. And that is really what this evening is about tonight. We want to understand some of the tools that are available to us, that are at our disposal, how to apply them, how to engage and enlist the broader community, not just those of us in this meeting, because we're already on the bus, but we need to get others on board. Cheryl Eiffel wrote that projects of reconciliation demand that individuals and communities demonstrate the willingness to acknowledge painful truths and to take responsibility for injustice. It can't be stressed enough that this has to be done at the local level, at the community level. That's why one of the most important roles that we play is to serve as an interface between the commission and the 14 or so existing county coalitions. They have the local knowledge and the relationships that the commission is going to need in order to maximize its chances of success. And I do want to note, by the way, that I believe the commissioner of the head of the chair of the commission has joined us tonight, and hopefully we might hear from him a little bit later, Dr. David Fakunle. So this is really especially important, this, using these the resources when it comes to preparing for the public hearings. This is where the rubber is going to meet the road here. As you may know, the commission is mandated to hold public hearings to investigate racial terror lynchings in the state. It will receive testimony from a variety of sources on the lasting effects of these murders in the communities where they were committed. And also they will solicit recommendations on appropriate ways to respond. The commission in turn is mandated to make recommendations to the governor and the General Assembly on how to address the legacy of lynching in ways that are rooted in restorative justice. And that's actually where I think we want to start tonight, because restorative justice is actually written into the law. It's a concept many are unfamiliar with. And in addition to his other credentials, Dr. Nick Query, who is with us tonight, he wrote the law. He worked with Delegate Pena Melnick to write the law. He's largely responsible for everything we know about the racial terror lynchings in Maryland. Most of it comes from Nick's work when he was at Bowie State. And we can't thank him enough for all of that. So Nick, I wonder if you might start and discuss a little bit what is restorative justice and how do you see it guiding the work of the commission?
Sure. Thank you, Will. That was incredibly generous of you. I still think of myself as a simple historian here. So to speak to matters and issues of justice when we have so many other more well qualified people, I will maybe just get us at the ground level and let them speak from their expertise. I guess before I start with restorative justice, I think maybe let's start with kind of the basics of retributive justice. That's kind of what we think of, that eye for an eye. Something happens and we demand retribution, hence retributive justice. Restorative justice, in my understanding of it, and again, a lot of it came initially through watching and listening to and reading about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. I'm a historian of Africa by training, and so I first learned about restorative justice through the concept of Ubuntu, the idea that we share a collective humanity, sometimes described as "I am because we are." And I just want to maybe, if you can indulge me, just share just a little bit of, Archbishop Emeritus Desmond Tutu's description of Ubuntu, because I think that really sets the stage for, how at least how I've come to think about restorative justice, and, how that will, I guess, lead into other ideas. And when we start getting into transitional and transformative justice, that others will be able to speak to much more eloquently than I. But Archbishop Tutu said, Ubuntu is the essence of being human. We say a person is a person through other persons. We are made for togetherness, to live in a delicate network of interdependence. I need other human beings in order to be human myself. I would not know how to walk, talk, think, behave as a human person, except by learning it all from other human beings. For Ubuntu, the great good is communal harmony. If one person is dehumanized, then inexorably we all are diminished and dehumanized in our turn. A criminal offense has caused a breach in relationship, and the purpose of the penal process is to heal the breach, to restore good relationships, and to redress the balance. Thus it is that we set out on to our work for reconciliation between the victim and the perpetrator. In restorative justice, both the victim and the offender play central roles. So I guess sort of my bargain basement sort of, dime store definition or description of restorative justice is focusing on that idea of repairing the harm. It acknowledges that when a law is broken or when something happens, harm is done. It's not just a matter of, a law has been broken, but someone's been harmed. And we need to recognize that that harm has happened. And as Archbishop Tutu said, sort of, to try to find a way to restore that peace, that balance, within the relationships. Now, one of the presumptions there is that there was a peaceful, harmonious time or set of relationships. And Sherry Lynn Eifel in her book certainly says that, when we start looking at things like Jim Crow and segregation and the context that provided, lynchings to happen was certainly not a time of peace and a time in which relationships were harmonious. So I think, when we talk about restorative justice processes, these are processes where there's a recognition that the victim is going to have a say in, how the case is going to be resolved. The victim and the perpetrator, ideally, are brought together, and there's a process to determine what justice is going to look like for both the perpetrator and for the victim, or the victim's loved ones who are involved in the process. And again, just thinking, to that idea of dehumanization, it just brings me back to Aimé Césaire's discourse on colonialism, where he says, the danger of colonialism is that it dehumanizes the colonialist at least as much, if not more, than it does the colonized. And so engaging in a process of restorative justice is a chance to reclaim the humanity of both the victim and the perpetrator. And I'm going to stop there and let.
Can I ask you a quick question
Sure.
before we go?
Sure.
So in the present context, in the work of the commission that we'll be undertaking, so what kind of, can you give me an example of what, and I hate to put you on the spot, well, not that much. Can you give an example of what, an example of an action that's, rooted in restorative justice? What would that look like for the commission?
There's the $64,000 question, or whatever budget that the state decides to give us. That's the value of that question. I think, if we take a look at the effects of lynching, short term and long term. Short term, is to generate and create terror, in African American communities. There is some real silencing that goes on. But there's also, that message that's sent out, you need to stay in your place. And part of that was also, don't even think about becoming economically well off or comparable in socioeconomic status with white people. So in addition to the psychological, the collective trauma that happens, there are going to be some significant economic consequences. How many people don't engage in economic activities that could generate wealth that could have stayed and sustained African American communities. Um, so I think if we're talking about what can the commission do, um, I mean, we can talk about let's and again, we were very strategic about not including the R word in the bill that was passed, but let's talk about reparations. And again, I'm thinking at this point, not just money. And again, I have some ideas, but in terms of recommendations, like what about schools? You know, um, somebody in the talking about the Wilmington massacre of, I think it was 1901, said, what about I mean, the cost to Black communities of lynching and race riots and those sorts of things is so great, that you're never going to be able to calculate you know um, a fair or a just amount. So let's think in terms of, because that effect is perpetual, let's think in terms of what kinds of perpetual things can we do to try to at least repair or start to repair some of that damage. How about free schooling? All Black students can automatically admitted to USM schools and don't have to pay tuition. There's like a whole bunch of things that we can do. But again, lynching was a public communal spectacle. And so the attempts to restore, if we're talking about restorative justice, have to be communal as well. They have to engage the communities that were affected by lynching. Those communities have to have some say in what justice is going to look like.
Yeah. So, and that's, I think you mentioned before that it's both parties have to be involved, and I think that is a potential obstacle in the present sense. So,
challenge, to be sure.
Yeah. So, Kelly, let me ask you, if I could you tell us what about transitional justice and how you see it applying to the work of the commission?
Definitely. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. My internet's a little bit funky, so just please give me a shout if we have any bumps along the way. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak in this gathering and to share a little bit from my area of research and teaching expertise. Today, I'm coming from you from Claremont, California, on Tongva lands. But normally when you catch me, I am in Williamsburg, Virginia, on the ancestral, traditional, and unceded territory of the Powhatan peoples. William and Mary, where I work, is 5 miles from Jamestown, where the English first arrived in 1607, and 30 miles away from Point Comfort, now Hampton, Virginia, where the first enslaved Africans were brought to English North America. And so it's a great privilege for me to be able to lend some of my expertise from transitional justice in international and comparative contexts to the US and to the Mid-Atlantic, my adopted home, and my now country of citizenship. I'm originally from Zimbabwe. In addition to, I guess, addressing these aspects of positionality, I want to state clearly that I'm a political scientist. I'm trained in international relations and comparative politics. And so you might notice that I might privilege the state or the government in terms of its role in transitional justice. So take it with a grain of salt, what I'm about to say. Nick did a great job about talking about how restorative justice is about repairing relationships, in particular between the victim and the perpetrator, or between victim communities and perpetrator communities. Transitional justice, the way I study it and the way political scientists look at it is similar. It's about restoring relationships, but this time, instead of between people, victim and perpetrator, it's between people and the government, right? Or the state. And sometimes that state is the offending government that is seeking to change itself. In other cases, it is a new government that is seeking to address the wrongs of the past by a predecessor government. Transitional justice has 4 main pillars. So there's truth, justice, reparations, and guarantees of non-recurrence or guarantees of non-repetition. A lot of us in the field have operationalized this or defined this as institutional reforms. So whether that's changing laws, that's reforming the police, some might even say defunding, whether that is putting in countries, let's say, term limits on presidents, et cetera. So there are these general 4 tenets of transitional justice: truth, justice, reparations, and guarantees of non-repetition. And there are different mechanisms or tools that countries can use to meet all of these. And so what's most pertinent to us when discussing the Lynching, Truth, and Reconciliation Commission is really that first pillar of truth, of acknowledgement. And for me, and I'm a little bit biased because most of my truth commissions are, I guess, my favorite transitional justice mechanism, is that they can enable many of those other mechanisms, right? So once you know the truth of the harm, then we can start talking about how to repair it via economic or symbolic reparations. We can start talking about what institutions to reform because we have named who was a perpetrator and what institutions were responsible or complicit for abuses. We can talk about, what type of justice we want based on the truth that we know. So I see truth commissions and the first pillar of transitional justice, truth, as enabling other forms and mechanisms of transitional justice. I was talking with my fellow co-panelists earlier that in the International Justice Lab that I direct at the College of William & Mary, we have been mapping past, present, and proposed truth commissions in the United States at the city level, the county level, the state level, and the federal level. And to echo Will's point, this is historic what's happening in Maryland. This is the first commission to address racial terror lynchings, perhaps the most insidious form of racial violence in the United States history, certainly within the last century plus. And so what's happening here is really commendable. I think actually, Will, you mentioned, or rather Nick not addressing the R word, right? But I think, you can kind of have some mission creep in terms of transitional justice in Maryland, where we can really build win upon win upon win, right? So in Guatemala, which is one place where I've done field work, the Truth Commission created the normative and the evidentiary basis for later reparations. And so see this not only as historic in the US in terms of other truth commissions that may follow, addressing lynchings or any other number of forms of abuse against people, in particular people of color and Black Americans, but also in terms of how this commission can position civil society groups, affected communities to demand more. And so I consider this a very exciting foundation on which we can and we should build. So I'll leave it there. Will, I don't know if you have any questions for me right now, anything you'd like clarified?
Actually, I was wondering if maybe you and Nick could talk about how the two concepts overlap, if they do, if it's a Venn diagram, what's shaded, and how does it affect the work of this commission. I really want to kind of focus on our task in Maryland, how we move forward and how we can use these tools to our advantage.
That's a really great question. One thing that I think about a lot, people say, oh, I don't know if people are ready to discuss this. Are they ready to be reconciled? Do people want to apologize on behalf of their ancestors? Do people want to forgive on behalf of their ancestors? For me, this is one thing that I like about transitional justice, again, viewing it from the lens of a political scientist, that it is a set of government provided remedies to address past violence is that you can just get going, right? And so from a policy point of view, right, we can start uncovering the truth irrespective of reconciliation happening, right? Because we don't know if people are ready and are willing and are able to have that moment. But that doesn't mean that the state of Maryland doesn't have a responsibility to act in the ways that it can, right? So assisting with memorial markers, providing documents, introducing institutional reforms, educational programs, reparations, like all of those things can happen without the interpersonal, which I think in some ways is the hardest piece. Of course, politicians make it seem like, oh, it costs so much money, we're gonna debate this, we're gonna debate that. But I actually think state policies
Am I the only one that's, are we getting a little funky here with the?
Yeah, she froze.
Okay. Oh no, here she's back. So, Nick, what about what do you see? What kind of overlap do you see between?
Yeah, I mean, I guess to follow up on Caleb Ogile's point there, again, just to have justice or to work towards justice, I would say, doesn't necessitate forgiveness. And that may sound counterintuitive, that may sound a little, funky here, but I mean, any of you who have kids, if you've ever, kind of caught somebody, it's like, doing, it's like one sibling does something to the other and you say, well, you have to, apologize, and you say, oh, well, I'm sorry, and it's not sincere, right? But they go through the motions anyway. And I think, again, I'm sort of brought back to that point that, damn, I just lost my train of thought. That, victims and perpetrators aren't, they're not gonna go through this process and come out of it at the end necessarily sort of, wanting to hug each other and wanting to spend time with each other. I don't know that there's going to necessarily be a kumbaya moment, but that doesn't mean that, just because we don't necessarily forgive, that we forget or that we can't make our peace. And so I think, what this, this moment, this commission provides is a real opportunity to look at the truth and to look really closely and to look really hard and to, encourage that collective introspection that needs to happen. Because if we're going to talk about justice in any way, shape, or form, there has to be that reflection. I mean, I could go on about the recent settlement in the HBCU's lawsuit, which I don't think really even comes close to scratching the surface in terms of what the state actually owes those four institutions. But it's a start. It's a step in the right direction. I think, yeah, we just kind of we'll take what we can get at this point. But no, I think we've got a real powerful moment here to really bring a lot of unpleasant, but necessary things to light, and to start those, I mean, when I hear people talk about difficult dialogue, I always say difficult for whom?
Right.
Because for those of us who've been on the receiving end, this is not something very hard to talk about in a lot of ways. For the, and I'm just going to use Robin DiAngelo's term, it's the white fragility that stands in the way so very often.
On the subject of unpleasantness, and this is tricky to game out in advance, we don't know what's going to happen, but expect opposition, right? Including from people you might least expect. So to give an example from South Africa, which is one of these like emblematic transitional justice cases, you had widows of freedom fighters who actually took the Truth Commission to court saying you cannot give amnesty, because that was one feature of the South African transition, that if you spoke the truth as a perpetrator, you would get full and effective legal amnesty. And so they took the commission to court over this, and they lost. And so you have, not all victims' families are going to view the issue the same way and share the same objectives, agenda, goals, and support the same means and methods of the commission as other people. And so in that context, that was one area of great tension, which again is where I think transitional justice differs substantially from restorative justice, because essentially the government gets to say, sure, but this is what we're going to do. And so I think just managing, and Virginie can speak much better to this as a practitioner and with, her wealth of experience on the ground, is managing expectations is going to be really important. I think even how people interpret South Africa is because that was a political project. South Africa had to transition from white minority rule and autocracy to Black majority rule and democracy. So the mythology of Rainbow Nation had to happen for there to be a successful transition. People hugging it out and being reconciled had to happen and was centered, right? But there were thousands, millions others who did not have that restorative moment, who did not have that reconciliation moment, but the nation just kind of had to keep going and carrying on. And so these are just some of the challenges that I've seen in other places. I'm seeing Katie here asking about the difference between transitional and restorative justice. And so as Nick talked about earlier, restorative justice is about repairing individual or community relationships that have been ruptured because of violence, whereas transitional justice is about doing the same, but between citizens and their government. So in Maryland, that's going to mean the state government, but also within the broader US, there are ruptured relationships that need to be restored between citizens, Black Americans in particular, and government at all levels, local, state, and federal.
Thank you, Kelly. That was really helpful. Virginia, I did want to ask you in your experience how other truth commissions have used public hearings to catalyze engagement on these issues.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen to try and show you all some images, because I think what I want to do today with my my brief time is to, let's see, there we go, is to kind of present some images of how truth commissions have handled public hearings, the formal public hearings, but also more broadly, how they've worked to reach out to different publics. And so first, public hearings are really, I think, an important and crucial moment in the life of a truth commission. It's the most public moment where the results of the research and investigations can come forward and open a platform for voices that have been marginalized, for stories that have been hidden or denied, to be heard publicly, to be affirmed officially and dignified. It's also a chance to increase public knowledge and visibility about these stories, and to try and advance a shared understanding about past and present. And as Kelly was mentioning, South Africa is one of the most, has captured the most public attention. And I think for better or for worse, sometimes in our work, we're struggling with countries wanting to replicate South Africa's model, not recognizing that it had to have amnesty because of the political compromise that it went through. But I think one thing that was really inspirational from the South African model was that before, truth commissions had hearings behind closed doors. South Africa was the first to say, no, we're going to have this out in the open. And it wasn't just about allowing a few people into the room. They had contracts with the major media, TV and radio. So it brought the public hearings into everyone's living room. And I think one of the things that really the commission did well was to try and limit the realm of permissible lies. So you're not necessarily going to reach consensus. You're not going to, as Nick and Kelly were saying, you're not going to get people with this kumbaya feeling. But at a minimum, you can try and establish a baseline of facts upon which then there can be healthy and vigorous debate. From that, Peru also had the public hearings, and they found that perhaps the setting in South Africa was a bit too much like a court. And so there was an effort there to really think carefully about the symbolism and the setup of the public hearings, placing, you can see in that picture, the commissioners and the survivors and victims who were testifying all on the same table at the same level. They also had an effort in Peru to have hearings in different parts of the country, especially in more marginalized areas, which was really important in terms of capturing the different narratives of the conflict. And in Tunisia, again, there was more of a return to the bit more of the formal public hearings, again, broadcast live on national television in the evening. And for victims who were able to testify at these public hearings, many said that it was an incredible opportunity to feel that their voices were finally acknowledged and heard. However, for many of the younger Tunisians that I've spoken to and worked with, they felt very disconnected from these public hearings, and they were the ones who were instrumental in bringing about the revolution that pushed out the dictator Ben Ali and brought about this Truth Commission. So I think it raises a question about, you want to think about not just about publicity, but also how do you open a space for really people to engage with the process. So here in Canada, I think our neighbor to the north is a place where we have a lot to learn for different reasons. Even though they had a Truth Commission that was looking at a different instance than what we're looking at here in Maryland, it was similar in the sense that it was a long-term legacy. The commission there was investigating the history of Indian residential schools, which is similar to the boarding schools that we've had here in the United States, where Indigenous children were forcibly removed from their families and placed in boarding schools run by the church and the state as part of a government policy to kill the Indian and the child. So the commission was established to finally recognize survivors and held public hearings all around the country. I think what's important from Canada is they realized that their mandate called for them to open a space for anyone affected by the residential schools to speak. And that involves recognizing intergenerational cycles of harm. But in their first hearings, there wasn't much of a youth focus, which they realized was something missing. So what they did, and I think any good commission should do, is respond, to be flexible and adapt in light of, this is all trial and error. What they did is they added a new component to their national hearings from then on out called Education Day. So every national event, which was a multi-day event, not just a couple-hour hearing, every national event started with a day dedicated to bringing students and their teachers to the national event. And in that way, they could focus on testimonies that were age appropriate, also work with teachers ahead of time to prepare them, and after the fact. So I'm just going to show you a brief video from one of these national events that also highlights the role of young people. And I want you to see, this is a different way of imagining what a public hearing might look like.
I'm Nathan Sack. As part of my job reporting at the Atlantic TRC event, I had an opportunity to speak with many youth. I did notice over 500 youth have attended the TRC Atlantic event. For some youth, this is a neat opportunity to experience Aboriginal culture. Other youth are very familiar with the history of the residential school. Michael R. Denny shares how the residential school impacted his family.
It affected our family, really profoundly. You could see that there's a lot of alcoholism, there's a lot of drug abuse in our family, but also there's been a really good thing happening in our family because of that, is that we turned to a traditional lifestyle.
How long have you been volunteering for TRC?
I'm currently on my second day.
Other Mi'kmaq youth from Wagaba First Nations were at our TRC Atlantic National event creating a documentary for the high school project. During this journey, these youth gained a deeper understanding of the impact residential schools had on the Mi'kmaq community.
When she was speaking, she said she wanted to be with her family, but she was taken away 1955 to 1963. She was only 6 years old, and from hearing from her stories, she was like, it was for her, she was in a prison because they tied her hands to her bed so she wouldn't get up during the night. She'd be beat for talking her Mi'kmaq language, and she was forced to eat her vomit if she had vomit. That's the way she would clean it up. So that brought a lot on me.
Now that the residential school is over, it still hurts them and they still think about it in their lives. I guess the way they would talk to everyone, the way they would treat everyone, and just how they trust people. I'm sorry that they had to go through all that.
What is it that we can do for the children who are here with us, for the children who are yet to come?
Through the work already done in other regions, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission understand the importance of sharing survivor stories with younger generations. Youth at this event were very grateful to share in the survivor's healing journey.
Thank you for sharing your stories. I really appreciate it. You made me feel something warm inside of me.
But I think I just wanted to show, like I said, that conceptualizing the public hearings as an event in which we bring in different parts of the community, working with teachers, with artists, with youth, with students, to see what role each of them can play. Because I think one thing that we did learn from Ken and other commissions is, from my perspective, I mean, the Canadian Truth Commission was one of the most survivor-centric commissions that really centered what was best for the survivors in their process. One challenge they did face, though, was how to raise awareness among the broader public. And here, Roger Simon notes, there's a difference between learning about and learning from the residential school history. And so I think for the context of Maryland, the challenge that we face is how do we connect past and present? How do we ensure that we can genuinely learn from this past and collectively take steps to prevent its recurrence in both the present and the future? So here I think, I look forward to hearing both from Terry and Chloe about some of the work that they already are doing and how that will hopefully connect up with the work of the Truth Commission. But I just want to show a few images from some work that we've done in different contexts and other ideas that might be inspiring for what we can do here in Maryland. Here in this, you see this montage of photos is something that we did in Tunisia called the Voices of Memory. It was a follow-up to the Truth Commission where many women were able to testify, but of course not everyone can come forward to the commission. So we worked with a group of intergenerational women, some who had had more direct experience of repression and the dictatorship, and some who had really become active during the revolution. And they shared their testimonies with a group of artists who then interpreted that and created an interactive exhibition. You can see the bottom right photo that kind of recreated the experience of incarceration, but also the experience of resilience and support that people who were incarcerated got from people who came to visit them. And at the end, we had what we call the reflection room, where we had questions asking those who had visited to reflect on, what they learned, and importantly, how these stories from the past relate to today, and getting them to think about what is their responsibility as citizens. What are they going to do with this, this new knowledge? Here as well from Tunisia, we had a workshop where we encouraged young people to sort of interpret their history. And here, I think also, one of the things that's in thinking about how do we extend the life of public hearings to be more than an iconic moment, but to be the basis for further action. One really important tool, I think, is the arts and creative approaches. So as just one example, in Colombia, our colleagues organized International Hip Hop Festival on Truth, Memory, and Resistance, in which they brought artists from around the world who use their music as a way of raising awareness of these messages. So the bottom left here, you see, this is a rapper from the Gambia who wrote a song, Never Again, about their process of transitional justice. And given his huge popularity among youth, he's able to pass messages about what this process means and about how young people need to get involved in a way that these young people aren't going to maybe tune into or read a report, but they will listen to his song. So thinking about these other creative approaches. And this is something from here within the United States by a group called For Freedoms, which is a coalition of artists that are working to increase civic engagement and discourse. And here, this is a billboard that you can see that was up in Alabama, really challenging us to reflect on this very important question. And I think what's unique about this is trying to think about what are the moments in which we can catch people's attention? What are the moments in which we can get some ideas into their minds? So really thinking about what are the resources culturally and artistically that we have within Maryland, and also what are the different ways that we can reach the people that we're trying to reach. So in closing, I just want to leave you with a quote from Commissioner Mary Wilson from the TRC in Canada, who just really highlights the fact that there needs to be deliberate strategy to reach beyond those who already know or beyond those who are already engaged, and thinking really creatively about how we do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Virginia. Based on that, some of the points you raised there, I actually wanted to ask Terry, if I could, about your experience in Memphis, and how were you able to, engage younger people there? What strategies did you have that you think might be worthwhile here?
Good evening. Thank you. So, I think that there was, honestly, there wasn't such an emphasis on young people, given that we were able to very, very frequently bring young people into the space and do really important tours that talked about the campaigns that took place during the civil rights movement. It was working with the adults. The children were, young people were much easier to deal with this. And so we actually worked at one point we hosted a Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearing that the Proctor Conference did in Memphis, and provided the space and the place for those really heart-wrenching testimonials, if you will, of individuals who were impacted. But there are a couple of things that do come to mind. When you work in these institutions that are big and frankly unwieldy in a lot of ways, because they are institutions, they're not nice and nimble, but you have certain assets available to you. It's important that it not just be a nice to do type of thing to participate and visit these institutions. It becomes a necessity, particularly for people who don't look like me, to visit these places. Because one of the things that I've found over my time working in museums that focus on what we call African American history, I call it American history from an African American experience in America, is that I'm required to know your history, Will. You're not required to know mine. And that needs to change. We need to just make sure that the history is taught. So what we really sought to do was begin Again, not so much with the students, but focusing on instructors, providing teacher training on different campaigns. One that we used to talk about, frankly, a lot was Black Power, Black Pride, and helping people understand the truth about the Black Power movement, about the Black Panthers, not the rhetoric that we hear. And because we had a group called, some of you may be familiar with them, Facing History and Facing Ourselves, which did quite a bit of work around Reconstruction and a lot of work also around lynching. We were able to partner with them, and they actually work in the schools with students that are taking what they call Facing History courses, where they talk about these issues all the time. But I do contend that children are much easier to work with. It's the adults that we have to get to the table. And I think this is kind of the conversation that Kelly was talking about when we start talking about transitional justice. And Nick, for that matter too, that in restorative, we're talking about the harm between individuals, but the transitional piece gets us out of having to listen to you say that you're sorry and really more focus on what you need to do to make right a situation from a state perspective. I think that's the hard work that we have to do. I do believe that it is important, it is critical for people to know what the truth is. And let me just make a pitch for museums, that I believe that museums are actually places that have a responsibility to tell the truth. Because if we don't document it, somebody else will rewrite it and document it. So that is, we are commanded to tell the truth and present the truth in a way, hopefully, that is more palatable to people, that it is interactive, that, you know, the clip that Virginia showed with the actual drumming and actual people engaged in the things that make people who they are, right? To be able to help people understand it better than simply reading it from a book. And that's what museums we are compelled to do that. But in the 21st century, we are also compelled to create the spaces where people can have not the difficult discussions, but make people comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Thank you. So, you know, I just want to pick up on that point actually that you just made, and Virginia did as well, that, you know, for the role of museums and other institutions is other, you know, cultural institutions. I think it's really critical to advancing this effort, this cause, and you know, because museums have, as you were suggesting, they have a, you know, a legitimacy, an appeal, a reach that is uniquely suited, I think, to deliver, you know, this message. And you know, some people don't like to read, but everyone feels. Right. And so I'm just wondering, and this might be unfair to ask you this right now, but I'm just wondering what, you know, how do you, at the Lewis now, I'm not talking about Memphis, at your new, at the Lewis, how do you see the Lewis becoming involved in this effort?
Well, you and I have had some conversations, Will, about how we might, what might become involved with this by actually incorporating these stories. Because what museums do is they tell stories. So incorporating these stories into the permanent exhibition at the Lewis. But I also see an opportunity for the Lewis to be a place where you could actually host the Truth and Reconciliation hearings. Very, very easily, I could see that occurring. I think that there are opportunities also to draw young people into expressing these truths, if you will, these stories, through a variety of creative mechanisms, like Virginia was speaking. One which I like is through spoken word, because I think spoken word is powerful, yet it is very comfortable for young people, and it evokes a lot of emotion. I see that Nick has his hand up.
I missed that.
Yeah, just a two quick points. I mean, since you mentioned Black Power and Black Pride, I think it's appropriate to point out and to say, yay, we're doing this on Malcolm X's birthday. And again, I'm still trying to figure out how we can work on getting that to become a federal holiday, but that's another struggle for another day. But just speaking to the power of museums, I mean, as I'm thinking about my daughter getting ready to graduate from high school this weekend, but when she was about 3, we took a trip out west and we ended up in Lawrence, Kansas at the Haskell Indian Nations University. And they had an exhibit of the letters from the children who were taken from their families, in very similar to what happened in Canada. And when we explained to her what was happening, she just lost it. I mean, she was like, oh my God, this is terrible. They took them from their mommies and their daddies, and I'm never gonna watch Pocahontas again. And to this day, I mean, she said, and I asked her about it not long ago, and she said, yeah, I mean, they made us watch it like when I was in 5th grade, but I have always felt really uneasy about it. And hearing that kind of explains why. So I mean, museums have a power and a reach in ways that the things that we're doing here won't. I mean, because as you said, I mean, people feel. And again, if my daughter is any indication, yeah, there's some real power that you have at your fingertips.
Thank you. So, we're talking around about the importance of the hearings, and I wanted to talk to Chloe, because her group is actually going to be the first group that is going to have a hearing. And Chloe is in, Allegheny County is a difficult culture, I want to just say, if that's okay. It's certainly not what Montgomery County is in this regard, as vis-a-vis this issue. And I wanted to just find out from you, Chloe, in the work that you've done so far, what are some of the, if you can describe some of the challenges you've already faced in engaging the community?
Yeah, thanks, Will, first for having me. And you are right. I would also use the word complicated, but the word you put is much more plain and direct and to the point. Some of the challenges, first off, is just the criminalization of the victim and a focus on punitive measures, right? And that there must, for someone to have been lynched, they must have done something wrong. And so they need to pay for that criminality without a recognition of all the systems and factors that led up to that incident that occurred, that they're being accused of. And then their subsequent, murder in such a heinous way. So I think that's the biggest challenge. And I think the second challenge is a lot of cognitive dissonance around understanding racial terror in the context of like just broader violence, right? That racial terror, it is systematic, it is upheld, it is a system within itself, right? And how that differs from why we're shining a light on racial terror lynching as opposed to other forms of violence that have occurred in our community.
And have you found in your, actually, I was wondering if you could describe, you have a very kind of, I think, interesting way of mediating some of these disagreements or differences, let's say. This that you're talking about, I was wondering if you could just describe that for folks here, because I think it's a useful tool that others may find helpful as well.
Absolutely. So, we've talked a lot about restorative justice and transitional justice. I'm going to add another form of justice into the mix here, transformative justice. And it's something that I've come to learn over the past few years and I'm still learning. And the way that I put it into context in this conversation is kind of like the mix between from restorative to transformative to transitional, right? So the core, while they're all sort of after the same thing of understanding who has experienced the harm and who has benefited or helped to cause the harm, transformative justice really zones in on that to understand, okay, of the people in the community who have experienced the most harm, let us take our leadership from them in understanding what restoration and repair looks like. And the other piece of it is that it's non-punitive. And that's, again, that's something that's really difficult for people to understand across all of these different types of justice. But within that framework, some of the tools that we use to get to this, the main tool we use is caucusing. And so you can caucus around any kind of affinity group or cohort. Because we're talking about race, of course, we're caucusing around race. So we have the Black folks get together in our community, and then the white folks get together in our community in separate spaces where they can process this truth and reconciliation work in those separate spaces before coming together. And the effort in doing so is that we can, both of us, examine our relationship and positionality to white supremacy and other forms of oppression, but then also that in doing so, when we come back together, we're not burdening the people who have experienced the most harm more. And we're also, those coming to the table who have benefited from the harm are more prepared and ready to listen and take direction. And what we've also found in this process is that bigger isn't better. Often when it comes to activism, I think our innate instincts are to do and to get a lot of people, right? Protests and rallies, they have an important place. But when you're talking about getting a group together to actually transform something, whether it be your community or whether it be a policy or a law, actually working in those smaller groups is really important. So we've also used caucusing to identify core allies within the community, and then building those allies to become accomplices, so that they're very strong advocates, that we're all speaking with one voice when it comes to what the BIPOC leadership is saying needs to be done to see transformation and change in the community.
And how long have you been doing this, just out of curiosity? How long have you been?
So my partner and I, Caroline, we've been doing transformative justice work for almost 3 years now. I'm sure she's been doing it a little bit longer. And we've been doing it in Allegheny County for 2 years. We've done it through the Allegheny County Lynching Truth and Reconciliation work. We started it with the Brownsville Project. We also expanded to the campus community at Frostburg State University. And we just wrapped up a caucusing session that lasted a year for the students there.
So, and let me ask you just one thing. How do you bring people into this tent? How do you get them in?
Yeah, finding allies, it's really interesting. We started by casting a broad net. And so that meant creating public spaces where any and everyone was invited. You put it up on social media, you see who comes. You say, okay, here's what we're here to do. We explain, this is what transformative justice is. These are the tools that we use. Normally by the second meeting, that group dwindles down very quickly, just because you've been upfront about what the work is required and what's really going to happen. And that's okay, because then you find your people who are really interested. And then you find that there's a core group that continues to stick with you, and that becomes that group that is really able to shift and move and make change. And they are able to go out to those people who maybe were interested in the beginning, but for whatever reason weren't able to stick with it, and help to shift bit by bit what's happening in their own lives, or find ways that they can still help and be a part of the change.
Thank you so much. So, you know, one other aspect of it, you know, when I just want to tell just a brief story. When I was in meeting very early on with Prince George's County, we were trying to get a coalition there going, and you know, I went through the thing, the slide deck, the whole thing. We had the discussion, sort of movie, and then someone asked me, "Well, what does reconciliation look like?" And I honestly, I was stumped. I didn't know what to answer, and I thought one thing that would be helpful tonight from all of you, and you've been warned, is that if you know, I would love to know what that vision is. You know, our goal, our process is, you know, tell the truth, right? Correct the historic record, understand how this white supremacy continues to degrade all of our lives, work to dismantle the machinery of white supremacy. But someone, you know, pointed out to me recently, it's really important to know what happens next, right? What happens afterwards? What is the vision there? And so I wanted to, before we lost time completely, I did want to ask all of you, if you would volunteer perhaps what you think that might look like. Would anyone like to?
I'm happy to jump out there.
Excellent. Let me find you here. Okay.
So I think it's interesting that it mentioned Malcolm X's birthday. We're also in the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa riots and the destruction of Black Wall Street. And so for me, reconciliation is really pretty simple. It's all about investment, and it is all about reparations in whatever form we want to talk about it. But we can't just say this is what happened and now let's go on with our lives. Something needs to be done. When I think about Black Wall Street and all that was lost, there's significant investment that needs to be made in Black communities. There's significant investment that needs to be made around education and making sure that people have access to not just education, but quality education, housing, the way our communities have been sliced and diced and put into these areas that don't allow us to do the things that we need to do to be able to thrive. When we look at environmental equity, when we look at where the government in many instances has decided to put the worst of the worst when it comes to environmental issues, these are all forms for me of reparations. And of course, there's obviously economic equity that we've got to be able to, put something into the people that we have taken so much out of. I just want to make this statement that, with regard to, the names of those who were lynched and the pardon that just occurred, as much as that was a good step, my mind immediately went to, we're pardoning people who were often falsely accused, often weren't even convicted, yet we're not going after the people who committed the crime. And so for me, that too is a part of reconciliation. I need to know that there is some resolution, or at least some zeal, if you will, in identifying who committed these crimes, and then making sure that there's that investment. So for me, it really is all about reparations.
It's interesting that you should mention that, by the way, because in many cases, especially in these instances of in the 1930s on the Eastern Shore, we know. I mean, there were people were interviewed, and there are records. So there's a pretty good idea, and I will be anxious to see how the commission chooses to address that. How about you, Kelly? Any things you'd like to share about your vision for what reconciliation looks like?
Yeah, so Terry, thank you so much for saying what you just said. I don't know what reconciliation looks like because I am not in the position of being a descendant of a lynching victim, right? Or being part of their family or broader community. But what I think we can do, and what I think would be appropriate, even from this positionality of not being part of the affected community in Maryland, is creating the permissive conditions, the conditions that allow reconciliation, right? So how are we going to be? We can't be reconciled if, our communities are degraded, if the environment is not clean and healthful, if schools are unequal, if there isn't equal access to political and economic institutions, et cetera. And so I really think to facilitate reconciliation and not just to depend on amazing Black grace to just forgive and overcome all, right, is to really address some of these historical inequities, create the foundations on which, Black folks in Maryland might then be willing and able and interested in forgiving and moving on. And on, I guess, on the other side of the equation, in terms of the white population, I think acknowledgement is absolutely essential. we can't talk about reconciliation if we don't agree on basic facts. And that's one thing that really disquiets me in our current political environment, is that we can't agree on certain basic facts. And I don't know the extent to which that is a problem in Maryland. I'm thinking more broadly in the US. I'm not an Americanist, I study politics abroad. But yeah, I definitely think like if we should be thinking about, if reconciliation were to happen, what would the state need to provide, right? What would white Marylanders have to provide? And let's work on those things before trying to like recreate a reconciliation moment, kumbaya moment, like that we've been talking about. Instead of being focused on that, let's create the conditions that would allow that, should it happen, but we can't force it, right? I don't know if on this call there are any descendants of lynching victims or potentially descendants of perpetrators, but like I think that reconciliation component is in a way between them and also, you know, members of their broader communities within the different counties.
Thanks, Kelly. Yeah, I'm reminded of what Cheryl Neifel said that night that you spoke at UB Law, when she said, you know, reconciliation is really a misnomer that assumes that there was some comedy beforehand. She talks, you should really talk about conciliation, not reconciliation. Nick, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, we were sort of talking before, you know, Terry was saying, well, you know, we're also Augusta, she's just going to say what they said. And I'm just going to, you know, start with, yeah, what she said. There has to be some kind of reparation. You know, what that looks like, I don't know. I mean, listening to you know, both folks talking, you know, before me, just sort of brings me back to, you know, my Catholic upbringing. You know, if you're gonna go to confession, right, you've got to confess your sins before granted absolution. You know, in Judaism, if I'm not mistaken, Will, I think I've done this before. You know, the Erev Yom Kippur, right? You have to make your peace with your fellow, you know, people, humans, before you can approach God to ask forgiveness. There has to be, you know, and again, you know, for, you know, we know in some cases, you know, who may have perpetrated these lynchings, but here again, the, you know, Holy Mother Church, you know, was not beyond, you know, the Inquisition was not beyond exhuming the bones of someone they found to be a heretic and burning them as a symbolic way of saying, we know you did wrong and you cannot escape punishment. You cannot escape punishment even after death, you know. And so one of the things that, you know, sort of come up in some of the early conversations I remember was talking about, you know, symbolic posthumous, you know, charging, you know, people with, you know, with the crimes. I mean, again, if we know who they were, you know, symbolically, can we have a prosecutor bring charges, you know, against that person? What that does legally, I'm not a lawyer, I don't play one on TV, but that seems to me, you know, at least a, you know, a way of saying, hey, we know who you are, we know what you did, we can't really hold you accountable, but just as we're trying to remember the names of those victims, so too maybe we need to sort of, you know, start a list of, you know, those known perpetrators.
Awesome. Thank you, Nick. Virginia, do you have any thoughts you'd like to add from your experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I want to do is just share this, my favorite cartoon from South Africa, from Sapiro. I think that just shows the challenge of, I don't know if you were aware of the slogan in South Africa. It was, I think, truth, the road to reconciliation. And here you have Desmond Tutu, you know, this map, and somehow truth doesn't lead directly to reconciliation. And I think it's just a good reminder that reconciliation is not this end state that I think we should put that on the burden of the Maryland Lynching Truth and Reconciliation Commission because it has that in its name. it's more, I view it more as democracy. It's this constant process that we're trying to work towards to support. I don't think we'll ever get there because conflicts will emerge, things will change. So it's really about, for me, it's more of a process and an aspiration. So this long-term goal that we have in mind, and how do we keep ourselves, you know, accountable to that aspiration and try and do what we can to reach a state of coexistence where I think everyone feels seen, heard, respected, and accepted. But just to highlight how challenging it is, and back to Kelly's point, that it's not so much about, in my view at least, individual reconciliation. It's more about what is the state's responsibility, what is the city's responsibility, given where these violations took place or where the failure to protect took place, and what can be done to remedy at those different levels. And also as citizens, what is our role to push for that and make our own efforts as well.
Thank you. Chloe, let me ask you.
Sure. I agree with what everyone has said. And the only thing that I might add is I hope that the reconciliation, the whole process of acknowledging the full history and the truth, you know, to plot a better way forward, is I hope that it sets the stage for us to reimagine our systems and our processes. You know, some might say dismantling, and maybe that's good where that makes sense, but I like the word reimagine, right? Just to be able to start from scratch. And I hope that reconciliation helps to set the foundation for people to be ready to do so.
Thank you so much. So I did notice that Commissioner, the chair of the commission is Dr. Falkenley is here, and I wondered, David, if I could impose on you to say a few words.
Cool. Well, first and foremost, greetings everyone. It's a pleasure to be a part of this conversation. I'll just say I agree with everything everyone has said. I hopefully have made it clear to my fellow commissioners, staff, including Will, the coalitions with whom we will work, such as Glory up in Allegheny County, and really everyone who's working with us. So Virginie and all of y'all part of this process. We're gonna draw a line in the sand when it comes to this referendum on racism. You know, we coming for the lynching, sure, because that's the topic that, you know, this commission is about, but we really gunning for everything. And I say that very intentionally. The racial terror lynchings were to preserve the system of white power. So yeah, the lynchings were bad, don't get me wrong. I've seen plenty of pictures. I know how horrible and inhumane they were. The system of white power is worse. So that's what I really want to take down. And everything that's happened in the past couple of years, I mean, the commission's only been around for 2 years, not even, quite honestly, has shown me that the universe is aligning in a way to make this movement ultimately undeniable. So let's keep it real. The Maryland Lynching Treatment Reconciliation Commission was voted in unanimously. So, Chloe, you're the people up in Allegheny County. They voted for us. When it came time to extend this to, what, June 2024? They voted for us unanimously. The Republican governor of this state pardoned 34 victims of racial terror lynching. Leverage, leverage, leverage. I'm still waiting for the person who really has the gall to come out and say we shouldn't do what we're doing. I haven't found them yet. So even if they believe it in their heart, they don't have the strength to say it out loud. Okay, that tells me all I need to know. So we will move forward with this work unapologetically. All right? If we piss you off, good. Get pissed off. Because white power has pissed me off my whole life. All right? The time has come for the fundamental shift in our society. And that shift is back towards our humanity. So when Nick talked about Ubuntu, I grew up with that concept. And I see how it has guided me through all of these predominantly white spaces with my black self, and it's made the difference for them and for me. So I know it's possible. And I've had too many moments, too many stories, and I'm glad I heard stories because this is all about the story. I'm a storyteller at heart. And what I do is help empower people to tell their stories. We want to empower people to tell their truth. So you're right. Reconciliation is a lie. I'm not even going to say misnomer. Lie. I'm not trying to reconcile with a damn thing in this country when it comes to my existence. What I will do is help reimagine the relationship in this country. Okay? So we really are a truth and healing commission, not a truth and reconciliation commission. The truth part is important. That is the foundation of what we do. Wherever we go in this state, it can be up to the mountains of Allegheny County, it can be down to the Eastern Shore. We telling the truth. We telling the truth. And we know that's going to take courage. So I am not naive to think there will be some pushback eventually. I am not naive to think there won't be some adversarial behavior. Okay, cool. We got history on our side, we got leverage on our side, and we have the moment on our side. So bring what you must. This is happening. And I hope in my heart and in my soul that we can do our best to tap into the humanity of anybody who gives us a second of thought. Good, bad, indifferent, ugly, beautiful, whatever. Because that's really what we're trying to do as well, is say, our humanity does not take away from yours. And I'm speaking as a black person. My humanity does not take away from yours. The humanity of those people whose lives were unnecessarily lost does not take away from anybody else. You've been lied to if you think that. And the ramifications and the damage has been generations long. So even if none of the victims of the lynchings are still here, the victims are still living among us. Because the system that lynchings help to preserve is still happening to this day, and in many cases is worse. So when we talk about reparations, I'm talking about financial reparations, I'm talking about intellectual reparations, educational reparations. You have to bring this back to whole in order for this to be worth it. And that is the process that we're looking to start. And yes, I want the state, all the cities, and the country to look at us. We know we got the pressure on us, and we're going to deliver. So join us.
David, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome, Will. You know I got you.
You do. So it looks like we're out of time. So before we go, I do want to thank Nick and Kelly and Virginie, Chloe, and Terry so much for being with us tonight. I want to thank the ICTJ for sponsoring this event, as well as the Lewis Museum. And I want to thank all of you for joining us. I hope it was worth your while. I think it was. And the recording will be posted, and we really, really appreciate your participation, and hope you'll be involved when these public hearings start, because we need everyone to be involved. Thank you again, everyone. See you next time.